Attack was not just Robert Aldrich's most uncompromising film. It was a $750,000 indictment of exactly the class system that had produced The Man Who Made It, a production that a congressional subcommittee investigated, that an American ambassador walked out of in protest at a European film festival, and that earned not a dollar in profits for the men who made it because the studio had already decided, in the architecture of its accounting, that the money belonged to someone else. We are digging into the wreckage of Attack with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury, secrets locked inside congressional hearing records, out of print critical assessments by Francois Truffaut, the specific financial instrument that stole the film's profits in plain sight, and the extraordinary biographical irony of the man whose family name is on the Federal Reserve's founding legislation, making a film about working men being destroyed by class-connected officers who bought their ranks with political capital. Robert Aldrich purchased the rights to Norman Brooks's Fragile Fox under circumstances that were, by standard Hollywood logic, entirely unpromising. The play had opened at the Belasco Theater in New York on October 12, 1954, run for 6 weeks, and closed without distinction. It had toured Cincinnati and Philadelphia before reaching Broadway and had failed to build the kind of critical momentum that would have made the rights expensive or competitive. Aldrich, by his own documented account, had never seen the play performed. He had read it, recognized what it was arguing, and bought the rights to a failed theatrical production that no other producer had found commercially interesting. He had arrived at Fragile Fox through the back door of 2 more obvious projects. He had attempted to acquire the screen rights to Irwin Shaw's The Young Lions and Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, both commercially established war novels with built-in audience recognition and the kind of literary prestige that attracts studio financing. Both acquisitions failed. What he found instead, in the rubble of those attempts, was a play whose commercial failure had made it available at a price consistent with the independent production budget he was working with, and whose argument that the most dangerous enemies American soldiers faced in Belgium in 1944 were the class-connected officers behind them rather than the Germans in front, was more radical than anything Shaw or Mailer had committed to print. The play that ran 6 weeks and closed became the film that a United States ambassador walked out of in Venice. The consolation prize was the better film. But the real problem was that Aldrich had not arrived at this argument by accident. He had been working toward it for a decade, trained by men who were being destroyed by the same institutional machinery he was about to put on screen. The biographical irony at the center of Attack has never been adequately examined in published accounts of the film, perhaps because it is so complete that it seems too neat to be real. Robert Aldrich was born in 1918 into a family whose connection to American political and financial power was not merely significant, but definitional. His grandfather, Senator Nelson Wilmarth Aldrich of Rhode Island, had served 30 years in the United States Senate and been described by the press as the general manager of the nation for his dominant role in framing federal monetary policy. His aunt, Abigail Aldrich, had married John D. Rockefeller Jr., making Nelson Rockefeller, future governor of New York, future vice president of the United States, Robert Aldrich's first cousin. The family that produced the director of Attack was, in the most precise possible sense, the family that Captain Cooney's father belonged to, the family that bought ranks, protected incompetence, and traded on political connections to insulate its members from the consequences of their failures. Aldrich had understood this from adolescence. The growing tension between his father's Republican orthodoxy and his own left-wing sympathies culminated in his decision to drop out of the University of Virginia in his senior year and enter the film industry at the lowest available NDA level, a production clerk at RKO at $25 a week, a position arranged through his uncle Winthrop. His father disinherited him. Aldrich responded by expunging public records of his connection with the Aldrich-Rockefeller clan and accepting the breach as the price of working in the only industry that would let him say what he wanted to say about the class that had formed him. The film he made in 1956, in which a cowardly captain's incompetence is protected by a politically ambitious colonel because the captain's father is a powerful man back home, was the most personal work of his career. It was also the one nobody recognized as personal because nobody knew who his family was. This is exactly why the Department of Defense's refusal to cooperate with the production was not merely a bureaucratic inconvenience, but a confirmation of the film's central argument delivered by the institution the film was accusing before a single frame was shot. The specific reasons why The Young Lions and The Naked and the Dead were unavailable to Aldrich illuminate the particular position he occupied in Hollywood's independent production landscape in 1955. Both books were being developed by studios with larger resources. The Young Lions was moving toward Edward Dmytryk's production at Fox with Marlon Brando, and The Naked and the Dead was heading toward Raoul Walsh's United Artists production with Aldo Ray. The rights were not merely expensive, they were unavailable. Aldrich's independent production company, Associates and Aldrich, founded in 1954 as only the second production after The Big Knife, operated at a scale that could not compete for properties already attracting major studio interest. What this sequence of unavailability produced was, paradoxically, a better film than either of the more obvious alternatives would have permitted. Both Shaw and Mailer, as adapted for the screen, retained enough of the literary prestige and commercial calculation of their source novels that the films made from them accommodated heroism alongside their cynicism. Attack had no such accommodation available to it. Norman Brooks's failed play had no literary reputation to protect and no commercial constituency to satisfy. Aldrich could follow its argument wherever it led without the negotiations that the more celebrated source material would have required. The film that resulted from getting what he couldn't have was more ruthless than the film he had been trying to make. The political intelligence that made Attack possible, the specific understanding of how institutional power protects incompetence because competence threatens the hierarchy above it, was not something Aldrich had developed in isolation. It had been formed across years of professional apprenticeship, in direct proximity to the men the Hollywood blacklist was in the process of destroying. From 1946 to 1948, Aldrich worked at Enterprise Studios, the independent production company co-founded by John Garfield, where he served as assistant director to Abraham Polanski on Force of Evil and absorbed the specific grammar of progressive political filmmaking at its most formally sophisticated. Polanski was blacklisted in 1951 following his refusal to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee. Garfield, unable to work and under unrelenting pressure, died of a heart attack in 1952 at the age of 39. The community of left-wing filmmakers whose work had shaped Aldrich's aesthetic was being systematically dismantled by the same institutional machinery that Attack depicted. Cowardice protected by political connection, competence sacrificed to the career calculations of men above it. The Federal Bureau of Investigation attempted to serve Aldrich with a subpoena during the McCarthyite investigations. The subpoena was withdrawn before it could be delivered. The most plausible documented explanation, recorded in accounts of the period, is that the Aldrich-Rockefeller family connection made the Bureau reluctant to pursue a case that would have required them to subpoena a man whose first cousin was Nelson Rockefeller. The institutional cowardice that withdrew the subpoena was the same institutional cowardice Attack depicted. Aldrich had experienced it personally, in his own favor, and had found it no less contemptible for having benefited from it. This is exactly why the film's most sophisticated formal quality, its refusal to offer the audience any character whose hands are entirely clean, was not a narrative choice, but a biographical observation. Aldrich produced Attack through Associates and Aldrich on a budget of $750,000, financed through an advance from United Artists and bank loans secured against the advance. The film was shot in 35 days on the back, lots of RK Opathe and Universal Studios. It performed adequately at the box office. By Aldrich's own account, it made money. The people who made it saw none of that money. The mechanism through which the profits disappeared was cross-collateralization, a contractual provision written into Aldrich's United Artists deal that grouped the financial performance of multiple films together, allowing losses from one production to offset profits from another before any net returns were calculated. The Big Knife, Aldrich's previous production for United Artists, had underperformed commercially. Its losses were under the cross-collateralization provision applied against Attack's profits. The accounting that resulted showed no net profit from either film, and therefore no payment beyond the initial advance to anyone associated with their production. As Aldrich stated directly in documented interview material, the film made money, but because the profits were cross-collateralized against The Big Knife, nobody saw any of the money. The financial instrument that extracted the film's profits was more sophisticated than anything the German army had managed in the Battle of the Bulge. It was also entirely legal, and Aldrich had signed the contract that authorized it. But the real problem was that the institution refusing his profit was only the second institution to formally oppose the film's existence. The first had been the United States government. The Department of Defense's refusal to cooperate with Attack, which denied Aldrich access to military personnel, equipment, uniforms, Signal Corps combat footage, and the use of any Army facilities, was not merely accepted by the production as a professional obstacle. It became a matter of congressional inquiry. A committee of the United States Congress, whose membership and specific mandate are documented in the TCM production records, formally requested that the Department of Defense provide statistics on other productions that had been denied military cooperation, using attack as the primary case study for an investigation into whether the military script approval process constituted inappropriate censorship of civilian cultural production. The investigation's final outcome is not preserved in any publicly available congressional record. What is documented is the subsequent reversal. A November 1956 Army memo established that attack had been denied exhibition at Army bases in Germany. A September 1956 Hollywood Reporter item reported that Army and Air Force officials had subsequently given their seal of approval and would assist in promoting the film. And a October 1956 Daily Variety item confirmed that the United States Navy had also approved the film for all servicemen. The institution that had refused to cooperate with the production was, within months of its release, officially endorsing its exhibition to the soldiers it depicted being destroyed by class-connected cowardice. The reversal was complete, unexplained, and never discussed in the film's subsequent critical literature. When Attack was screened at the Venice Film Festival in 1956, where it won the Italian Film Critics Award, one of 3 festival prizes Aldrich received that year across 3 different films, the United States ambassador to Italy walked out of the screening in protest. The gesture was documented in trade press coverage of the festival and constitutes one of the more precisely ironic moments in the film's reception history, a representative of the American government performing the same institutional reflex that the film's villain performs throughout, walking away from an uncomfortable truth rather than sitting with its implications. The ambassador's name does not appear in surviving accounts. His action does. He was the living demonstration of Bartlett's conundrum, the man who knew the truth and found the career calculus of acknowledgement too costly to bear. This is exactly why the Italian critics who awarded the prize understood the film better than the American establishment that officially endorsed it did, because they were watching it without the specific institutional anxieties that made its argument so threatening to the people it depicted. The production's logistical response to the Department of Defense's refusal to cooperate has been documented in terms that emphasize Aldrich's resourcefulness without fully examining its implications. He stated, "The Army saw the script and promptly laid down a policy of no cooperation, which not only meant that I couldn't borrow troops and tanks, I couldn't even get a look at Signal Corps combat footage. I finally had to buy a tank for $1,000 and rent another from 20th Century Fox. The tank sequences were filmed on the Albertson Ranch locations in Agoura and Triunfo, California, terrain that Aldrich production designed dressed to approximate the Belgian village environment of the Ardennes. The physical destruction of the final act, the tank crushing Costa's arm, the building collapses, the street fighting, was achieved through prosthetics, practical mechanics, and controlled impacts on a domestic backlot by a crew working against a shooting schedule that allowed no excess. 35 shooting days, $750,000. A $1,000 tank and a borrowed one. The film that emerged from these constraints has a physical texture that its limitations accidentally enforced. The claustrophobia of the basement, the tightness of the corridors, the way the camera is always too close to the action, all of these were imposed by the production's inability to spread out across the kind of European locations a better funded production would have demanded. The Department of Defense's refusal to cooperate had, inadvertently, made the film formally consistent with its own argument. There was nowhere to escape to in Belgium in 1944, and there was nowhere to escape to on a California backlot in 1956. In 1955, the year before Attack was released, François Truffaut, then a critic for Cahiers du Cinéma and not yet the director of The 400 Blows, wrote about Robert Aldrich in terms that constitute one of the more prescient critical assessments in post-war film journalism. In Aldrich's films, Truffaut observed, "It is not uncommon to greet one idea per shot," a formulation that identified, in the work Aldrich had done up to that point, a density of formal intelligence that American critics had not begun to notice and that the industry that employed him had not acknowledged. Truffaut was watching Kiss Me Deadly and The Big Knife and seeing, in their visual construction, the formal ambitions of a director who understood that the camera's relationship to the actor in a given frame was itself a political statement, that where you put the camera determined who had power in the scene, and that Aldrich always put it where power was most uncomfortable. The observation applies to Attack with particular precision. The angles that reduce Cooney, the angles that enlarge Costa, the specific geometry of the basement sequence, in which the power relationships of the entire film are spatially compressed into a single enclosed space. These are not the work of a director shooting efficiently against a tight schedule. They are the work of a director who had been thinking about institutional power and its visual representation for a decade, and who had found, in Norman Brooks's failed play, the exact material, that allowed him to put that thinking on screen. The specific relationship between Attack and Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, released the following year, has been acknowledged in film scholarship without being fully examined. Kubrick's film, which depicts French officers ordering an attack they know will fail and then court-martialing the soldiers who survive it for cowardice, shares with Attack not merely a general anti-war argument but a specific formal vocabulary. The long tracking shot through the trenches, the spatial grammar of officers' quarters versus soldiers' positions, the institutional cowardice expressed through architectural separation. Kubrick, who was in the process of developing Paths of Glory during Attack's production year, had access to the film and is documented in Senses of Cinema's critical assessment as among those who found in Aldrich's work a model for how to make a war film whose argument resided in its visual construction rather than its dialogue. The cynicism that Attack expressed in 1956, the critics called harsh and excessive. The cynicism that Paths of Glory expressed in 1957, they called profound. The argument was the same argument. The director who received the credit for it was not the one who made it first. The screenplay of Attack was written by James Poe, the same James Poe who had written The Big Knife for Aldrich the previous year. The recurrence is not incidental. The Big Knife, based on Clifford Odets's play, depicts a Hollywood star whose career is owned by a studio boss who uses financial leverage, personal blackmail, and institutional dependency to prevent him from exercising any genuine autonomy. Attack depicts soldiers whose lives are owned by a military hierarchy that uses political connection, institutional loyalty, and the threat of professional destruction to prevent them from exercising any genuine accountability. The argument in both films is identical. Institutional power uses the structures it has built to protect its own incompetence at the expense of the people who depend on it. And in both films, that argument is articulated through James Poe's specific dramatic vocabulary, the confrontation that cannot resolve itself through legitimate channels, the choice between complicity and destruction. Aldrich hired the same writer for the same argument twice in consecutive years, and the industry that produced both films never noticed the pattern. Eddie Albert, who played the cowardly Captain Cooney, was approaching his 50th birthday during filming, significantly older than the character as written, a discrepancy that Aldrich accepted because Albert looked younger than his age and because the performance he was capable of exceeded any age-matching concern. What made Albert's casting the film's most structurally complex decision was the specific inversion it created between the actor's documented history and the character's fictional one. Before the war, Albert had been working covertly for United States Army intelligence, photographing German U-boats operating in Mexican waters. At the Battle of Tarawa in 1943, under heavy enemy fire, he had personally rescued more than 70 wounded Marines, loading them onto his landing craft and taking them to safety. He lost a portion of his hearing from the battle noise. He was awarded the Bronze Star with the V device for valor. The man playing the officer who freezes and refuses to send reinforcements while his men die was, in documented historical record, the man who drove his boat into Tarawa's fire to pick up the people his character would have left behind. Albert never discussed this inversion publicly. Aldrich never mentioned it in interviews about the casting. The gap between the actor's history and his characters is the film's most uncomfortable irony, sitting in plain sight in every frame. Bosley Crowther in the New York Times found the film honest and unflinching, generous praise from the critic, whose reviews Aldrich had learned to read as a specific kind of institutional temperature gauge, while qualifying it as more notable for its vigor than its depth. The qualification was the tell. Crowther recognized the film's argument well enough to acknowledge it and then retreated from its implications behind an aesthetic hedge. Variety, whose trade paper assessment was published in the week of the film's October release, praised the performances while finding the material deliberately provocative, a formulation that treated the film's political argument as a marketing strategy rather than a position. The reviews that found the film's cynicism excessive were written by people whose professional and social world was sufficiently adjacent to the world. The film was depicting that excessive felt like a more comfortable verdict than accurate, but the algorithm of history has vindicated Attack as something that 1956's critical establishment was institutionally prevented from receiving. Not a cynical war film, but a structurally precise argument about how class operates inside military institutions an argument that Aldrich, alone among his contemporaries, had the biographical authority to make because he had grown up inside the class he was depicting. The film's relevance has not diminished across 7 decades because the mechanism it describes, incompetent men protected by political connection, competent men sacrificed to institutional loyalty, has not changed. The captain who cannot fight but whose father is powerful back home has appeared in every American military engagement since 1944. The colonel who knows the captain is incompetent but calculates that protecting him serves his own career is the permanent figure of institutional cowardice, present in every organization that has ever existed. Time Out ranked the film 26th among the 50 best World War II films ever made. The ranking is conservative. In the film's final sequence, the surviving soldiers agree to cover for the man who killed Cooney, to report that the Germans did it, to absorb the lie into their institutional record, to protect the man who did what they all wanted to do and couldn't. Bartlett knows. He takes the promotion he was going to offer anyway. The cover-up succeeds. The institution continues. No one is held accountable. The credits roll. Here is the question. Attack embeds in that ending with the precision of a man who grew up in the family that wrote the rules. When an institution, a military, a studio, a family, a government is so thoroughly structured to protect its own incompetence that accountability becomes institutionally impossible, is the individual who finally acts outside the structure a hero or simply the person who drew the short straw? And is the cover-up that protects him afterward an act of loyalty or an act of complicity with the same system that created the problem in the first place? Leave that in the comments. The argument is the point. If this investigation changed how you see Attack, leave a like, because there are 1,000 films with buried secrets that deserve the same forensic attention, and the algorithm needs to know this kind of digging matters.